The key card in Della Voss's hand, still warm from her apron pocket. It was the only thing on her that night that wasn't borrowed. The one wedding dress arrest was all $400, due back by noon tomorrow, or she'd lose the deposit. The shoes were Marguerite's, half a size too tight. Even the perfume at her throat belonged to someone else, sprayed on in a hurry in the staff changing room, because she didn't own a bottle of her own. Only the key card was hers. She had swiped it 3,000 times in 3 years. She knew the 14th floor corridor of the Ambassador Hotel better than she knew her own father's face. Behind her, Cordelia Ashbury's heels came fast down the carpet, breathless. Della. Oh, Della, what are you doing up here? She didn't turn around. 300 people are sitting downstairs. They've poured the champagne already. Have you lost your mind? Room 1412. Della's voice was strangely level. Do you want to know how I know the room number? Della, because I'm the one who swipes the door open for this room. For 14 months, I work nights here, Cordelia. She paused. 3 years. You never once asked me where I worked, Cordelia gaped, her throat tightening as all her words deserted her. The light on the lock turned from red to green. A small click, a sound Della had heard 3,000 times, and not once had it ever meant anything. The door swung open. Spencer Holloway stood at the mirror, retying his tie, navy silk. She had picked it out 3 weeks earlier at a store where she'd put it on a 6-month payment plan. Marguerite sat on the edge of the bed, bare feet, hair undone. The ivory bridesmaid dress hung over the chair back like a shed skin. And the first thing her sister did not pull up the sheet, not cry, not say a single word, was glance at the clock. At the door, the service elevator slid open. A wheelchair rolled out half a turn, then stopped. The man in it looked up at the floor number on the wall. 14, not the floor he'd pressed. His hand went to the closed door button, then he heard her voice. Base, Spencer said, and the smile came out on reflex, the one he used on investors. It's not what it looks like. It's exactly what it looks like. Della hadn't moved off the threshold. It's been exactly what it looks like for 14 months. Cordelia threw herself between them. Arms spread the way people do at a car wreck. Close that door. Close it right now, do you hear me? Today, of all days, you would drag my name through. The man's hand at the end of the corridor still hovered over the button. He didn't press it. Bing, the main elevator opened. 3 people stepped out. Black coats, Chicago snow still melting on their shoulders. The one in front carried clipboard. Spencer Holloway. Spencer straightened. The smile came back. Same width, same warmth. Yes, FBI. We have some questions about $2.8 million withdrawn from the Ashbury Capital Pension Fund over the past 11 months. Cordelia laughed. A high sound, broken clean through the middle. You came here about a bed? This is a family misunderstanding. You have no right. We're not here about the bed, ma'am. The agent turned a page. We're here about the account. Every dollar of it moved through an account in the name of Marguerite Ashbury. Della turned to look at her sister. In 3 years, she had carried a tray across that ballroom downstairs 1,200 times. She had wiped tables for men who called her sweetheart. She had stood 9 hours a night to pay for medicine for a woman in West Virginia she couldn't save anyway. My wages, she said. 3 years of them. And the pension fund of 140 housekeepers in this building, the ones who ride the service elevator with me every night. Marguerite stared blankly, utterly silenced by the weight of her own exposure. You took all of it, Della said, through an account with your own name on it. At the end of the corridor, the service elevator slid shut. Nobody noticed. Nobody ever did, on the 14th floor of the Ambassador Hotel. No one had ever paid attention to the man in the wheelchair, and that was exactly why. Since the explosion, not one soul in the city of Chicago had ever managed to touch him. And downstairs, 300 guests still raised their glasses, still laughed, still waited for the bride to come down. If Della's story stayed with you, leave a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel because every week, we tell the story of someone the world forgot to look at. They didn't take Della down in the main elevator. 2 security guards in gray suits were waiting by the service elevator, the very elevator she had ridden 3,000 times beside carts piled with bed linens, and they extended their hands toward the open doors as though inviting in an honored guest. Della stepped inside. The hem of her where only that morning, someone's spilled coffee had left a dark stain. She heard the orchestra before the doors opened. It was the waltz she had chosen back in September, chosen because it was slow, because she had been afraid she might stumble on that long carpet beneath the gaze of 300 pairs of eyes. Now it was still playing. No one had told them to stop. Then Hollis Ashbury stepped onto the platform. He didn't need a microphone. He merely raised one hand, and the violins fell silent in the middle of a measure, which cut short like a string severed by a blade. 300 heads turned. In the corner of the ballroom, the trim camera light flickered on, the small red light Della had seen at every party she had carried trades through over the past 3 years. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hollis said. His voice was warm. He was always warm. Warmth was what he sold. "I apologize for interrupting your evening, but that there are some things that must be said at once, because if you don't tell the story yourself, someone else will tell it tomorrow, and they'll tell it wrong." He paused for exactly 2 seconds. He always paused for exactly 2 seconds. 4 years ago, our foundation launched a sponsorship program. It was a small and quiet initiative. We searched for young people from difficult circumstances in communities that had been left behind, and we gave them a chance to rise. Miss Voss was the first person accepted into that program. Della stood at the edge of the ballroom. No one led her to the platform. She simply stood there in her white gown as the entire room turned to look at her at once, and she realized that this was the first time in 3 years that all 300 people in that room had looked directly into her face. "Tonight," Hollis continued, "that program comes to an end. From this moment forward, there will be no connection of any kind between Ashbury Capital and Miss. No financial connection, no legal connection, no personal connection." A whisper swept across the tables like wind passing through a field of grain. "Who is that girl?" "The rumors say she's Hollis's illegitimate child, Marguerite's half-sister." "No, weren't you listening? He called it a sponsorship, my God. She served me wine here last month." The first security guard stepped forward. He was young, perhaps 25, and he couldn't bring himself to meet her eyes. "Your phone, Mom." Della handed it over. It was the company phone issued to employees on the 14th floor, with a black plastic case and a crack in one corner that had been there since April. "Your employee badge." She handed that over too. The card still held the faint warmth of her body. Then the guard said nothing more. He simply stood there and his gaze dropped to her throat, and Della understood before he ever opened his mouth. "No," she said. "Mom, I have my orders. This doesn't belong to them." Cordelia came forward. She had been crying, and she cried beautifully, the way a woman could only cry after years of practice, with 2 perfect trails of tears running down her cheeks without disturbing so much as a trace of lipstick. "Della, you're making this so difficult for everyone." She touched Adalda's arm, and her hand was truly trembling. That was what chilled Della most. "Everything you're wearing belongs to this family. You came here with nothing, don't you remember? Don't you remember that day?" "I remember." Della didn't take her eyes off her. "I remember it more clearly than you think," then handed over. The silver locket was no larger than a coin. Its edges had been sealed shut with an ugly line of solder, the work of someone whose hands had never been trained for such a task. Della had worn it for 12 years. She had worn it while carrying trays, while wiping tables, while standing for 9 hours each night, and while sleeping. She reached behind her neck and opened the clasp herself. She did it slowly, while the entire room watched in silence. Not one of the 300 people tried to stop her. The locket fell into the young guard's palm. He closed his fingers around it at once, as though afraid it might look back at him. Marguerite had come down to the ballroom at some point. She had already found time to change her dress and brush her hair again, and she stood beside her mother with perfectly reddened eyes. "Father," she said, her voice breaking in exactly the right place, "let her go. No matter what she did to me, I still forgive her." Cordelia turned toward the crowd, and she didn't speak those words to Della. She spoke them to the 300 guests and to the red light glowing in the corner of the room. "All I see is one daughter standing here in tears." The other brought the police into the wedding. Several people nodded. Someone seated near the doors murmured, just loudly enough to be heard, that outsiders could never truly be trusted, that blood was still blood. Hollis remained on the platform. He didn't look at her. In 4 years, he had never looked directly at her for more than 3 seconds at a time, as if looking at her face forced him to look at the guilt of his own past, and it had taken Della a long while to understand that it wasn't because he hated her. He simply didn't see her standing there at all, Miss Voss. He said to the room, "This family gave you a home, an opportunity, a name you could stand beside." Della took 3 steps toward the platform. She didn't raise her voice. Later, the people seated at the front tables would say that the most frightening thing was that she never raised her voice at all. "You can't disown me, Mother Ashbury," she said. "You never claimed my niece in the first place. You only took a photograph." No one reacted. The orchestra began playing again. Someone had signaled for them to continue, and the violins rose to fill the emptiness where her words had fallen. The 2 guards escorted her to the doors. They weren't rough with her. They even held the door open. Outside, snow was falling over Michigan Avenue. Thick and slow, the kind of February snow that descended on Chicago as though it had the whole night ahead of it. The glass doors closed behind her, and through them she could hear the orchestra, the laughter, and the delicate ringing of glasses touching glasses. Della Voss stood on the sidewalk in a rented wedding gown, and there was no longer a single thing on her body that carried her name. She sat down on the 3rd stone step from the bottom. There was no particular reason for choosing the 3rd step. Her legs simply stopped there. 4 hours passed on that step, and during those 4 hours, Della Voss counted 211 people walking past her, and not one of them stopped. The wedding gown soaked up snow like a sponge. First the hem grew wet, then the lining, and before long the entire dress weighed nearly 11 pounds more and clung to her legs, cold as a damp hand. Marguerite's shoes were half a size too small, and by the 2nd hour Della could no longer feel her toes, and she thought with remarkable calm that perhaps that was a good thing. The hotel doorman came outside twice to ask her to leave. The first time he was polite. The second time, he wouldn't look at her. He only said that management had requested it, then turned and went back inside. He didn't force her away. He merely delivered the message and left her sitting there, and Della understood that he worked the night shift too, and she didn't feel the slightest anger toward him. By the 3rd hour, she stopped looking at the street. She stared instead at the glass behind her, where the golden light from the lobby spilled onto the sidewalk in a warm pool, melting every snowflake the moment it touched the ground. On the other side of that glass, 300 people were still eating dessert. On this side of the glass, one woman sat in a wedding gown. Less than an inch separated them. Then she heard wheels moving across the snow. It wasn't the sound of a car. It was a very soft, steady sound, 2 circles grinding through the fresh snow, and it was 3 steps away from her. Della didn't look up at once. Over the past 3 years, she had learned that when someone stopped in front of her, it was best to wait for them to speak first. The man said nothing. He simply sat there. When she finally raised her eyes, she saw a man of about 34, with closely cropped black hair and a gray wool coat, without a single snowflake resting on its shoulders, and she immediately thought that he had just out of a car rather than walked there. He didn't take off his coat and offer it to her. He didn't ask whether she was all right. He didn't reach for his wallet. He only looked at her, and there wasn't a trace of pity in his gaze, and that was precisely why Della didn't turn away. "What are you looking at?" she asked. Her voice was hoarse after 4 hours of silence. The man didn't answer immediately. He looked over her shoulder, through the glass, into the pool of golden light, then looked back at her. "I'm looking at a woman who walked into a fire wearing a wedding dress," he said, then walked back out on her own. Della turned her head to look at the lobby behind her, then faced him again, and she thought it was merely an idle remark from a stranger, the kind of thing people said when they didn't know what else to say in front of a ruined wedding. She didn't ask him anything more. Later she would remember that she hadn't asked him anything more. Snow fell between them, and for a long while, neither of them spoke. "I don't know your name," Della said. The man waited. "I can see that you have a battle of your own. I'm not asking about it. But today, you looked at me in a way that none of the 300 people in that room ever has." She stood up. The soaked gown dragged her downward, and she had to brace one hand against the stone to rise. But at last she stood upright in that ruined wedding dress on the sidewalk of Michigan Avenue. "I have no money, no family, and after tonight, I have no dignity left to lose." She drew in a breath. "Will you marry me?" The man in the wheelchair didn't laugh. He didn't look surprised. He only watched her for another moment before speaking in his voice as level as if he were reading out a number. "No." Della didn't move. "You're cold," he said. "Cold people say foolish things. Tomorrow morning you'll wake up in a warm bed and thank God that I said no." Laughter sounded from behind the glass. Della didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Marguerite stood close to the doors with her phone raised, while Spencer stood behind her, laughing at the screen. The flash went off twice through the glass, two whites falling across the snow. Della didn't look back. She stared directly at the man. "You think I'm saying this because I'm cold," she said. "I worked the night shift in this building for 3 years. I stood for 9 hours every night. I know what cold is. I'm not saying this because I'm cold." She stepped down one stair. "I'm saying it because, during the last 4 hours, 211 people walked past the place where I was sitting. I counted every one of them. No one stopped. You're the only person who stopped, and you're the only person who didn't give me anything." She paused. "Do you know why I want to marry you? Because everyone in that room gave me something. A home, an opportunity, a name I could stand beside. Then they took it all back in 10 minutes. And they had the right to take it back because it belonged to them." Snow settled in her hair now and no longer melted. "You haven't given me anything. So you have nothing to take away." The man in the wheelchair remained silent for a very long time. Long enough for Della to hear the orchestra inside begin another song. Then he placed one hand on the rim of his wheel, pushed it forward half a turn, and moved closer to her by exactly the distance of a single step. "My name is Rafferty Malloy," he said, "and the answer is yes." Chicago City Hall opened at 8 o'clock, and by 8:15 the line already stretched around 2 bends in the ground floor corridor. 3 days after that snowy night, Della Voss stood in that line, wearing a gray sweater she had bought for $2 at a thrift store on Clark Street. And beside her sat a man in a wheelchair, didn't say a single word during the 40 minutes they waited. People glanced at them. Not often, and not for long, because on a Tuesday morning at City Hall, everyone had business of their own. A young woman ahead of them apologized for stepping back too close to the wheel. Rafferty Malloy told her it was all right. That was the only thing he said until they reached the counter. The woman behind the glass slid a stack of papers and a tethered ballpoint pen toward them. She had been doing this for 20 years, and her voice was as flat as a tabletop. Relatives, place of birth, previous marital status. Della wrote quickly, her handwriting neat and small, the kind of handwriting that came from filling out thousands of order slips in dim light. Then her pen stopped. The box sat in the middle of the page, no larger than any of the others, printed in the same size type. Father's name. Della stared at it for about 4 seconds. She had filled in that box before. She had filled it in at the clinic in Beckley when her mother was first admitted to the hospital, and she had filled it in at the school district office when she was 16. And every time she had written the same 2 words, and every time those 2 words had looked perfectly ordinary on the paper, perfectly administrative, as though they meant nothing at all. Unknown. And she continued to the box below without pausing. Rafferty Malloy saw it. He sat about 1.5 feet lower than she stood, and the papers were tilted at exactly the right angle for him to read them. He said nothing. He didn't look at her. He only reached out and took the papers, which she pushed them toward him, then filled out his portion, and in the box for his father's name, there was a complete name with a middle name, written in the kind of handwriting a person acquired only after years of signing important things. The ceremony took place in room 4. Lasted 9 minutes, and the witnesses were 2 strangers the clerk called in from the waiting benches. One of them was still holding a cup of coffee. Della had no flowers. She thought about that when they stepped into the corridor, and she saw another couple taking photographs on the staircase with a small bouquet of roses, and she thought, oh, so people do bring flowers, and then she stopped thinking about it. Spencer Holloway stood at the foot of the stairs. He wasn't wearing a suit. That was the first thing Della noticed, because in 14 months, she had never once seen him leave the house without one. He wore a heavy coat with his hands buried in the pockets, and there were dark circles beneath his eyes that no amount of makeup could have hidden. "I'm not here to do anything," he said at once, raising both hands. "I only came to tell you one thing." Rafferty Malloy didn't look at him. He studied the steps, calculating the path to the exit. "Go ahead," Della said. Spencer smiled. It wasn't the smile he used for investors. This one looked far more tired. "You think I was going to marry you for love," he said. "Della, you sat across from me at dinner for 14 months, and you never once asked why I chose you. Did you think it was because you had a pretty smile?" He stepped closer. His voice dropped, and for the first time in 14 months, it sounded real. 4 years ago, you signed a stack of papers. Did you read them? Della didn't answer. She didn't need to, because in her mind, that afternoon had just opened like a door she had believed was locked. The fourth-floor office, the smell of coffee, Hollis Ashbury sitting across from her, warm and patient, sliding a thick stack of papers toward her and saying it was only routine paperwork for the program, that she only needed to sign where the pages were marked. 11 pages. She was 24. She had just arrived from West Virginia. She hadn't slept in 3 nights, and inside her coat pocket was a hospital bill she couldn't bear to unfold and read again. She signed in 11 places. She didn't read a single line. She signed because the man sitting across from her had just promised to pay for her mother's medicine. That account, Spencer said. The one the FBI has now. Marguerite's name isn't the only one on it. He looked at her. You're the joint signer. You signed 4 years ago. Your signature is directly beneath hers. The City Hall corridor remained noisy. Someone called out a number. A child ran laughing, with his mother chasing after him. A wife can't be forced to testify against her husband, Spencer said. I studied law for 2 years before I quit. Did you know about that rule? He drew in a breath. I was going to marry you so you couldn't open your mouth. And when everything fell apart, the names on the account would be yours and Marguerite's, not mine. Never mine. Della stood perfectly still. Why are you telling me this? She asked. I don't know, Spencer said, and this time he was telling the truth. Maybe because I'm about to lose everything, and I want at least one person in this world to know exactly what I am. He glanced down at the wheelchair, and the look was quick, but Della caught it. And you went and married this. Della stepped down 1 stair. The man you just looked at, she said, without raising her voice in the slightest, has more backbone sitting down than you've had standing your entire life. Spencer tried to respond, but his jaw merely twitched as he choked on his own excuse. He stood there for another 2 seconds, then turned away and walked through the revolving doors into the snow, and that was the last time Della Voss ever saw his face. Outside, Rafferty Malloy waited on the sidewalk while Gideon Parr brought the car around. Della stood beside him, holding the marriage certificate, still warm from the printer. For 4 years, I thought I'd been given an opportunity, she said. It turns out I was given a signature so I could take the blame. Rafferty Malloy said nothing. I walked out of one trap, Della said, and stepped straight into another. I just don't know what shape this one has yet. He looked up at her. For a very long time. Yeah, he said, the apartment was on the ground floor of a red brick building on Hoyne Street in Wicker Park, about a 4-minute walk from the elevated train station, if a person was able to walk. Gideon Parr opened the car door, pushed the ramp up to the front steps, then moved back exactly 3 paces and stood there with his hands clasped in front of his stomach, and Della noticed that he didn't help, didn't touch the chair, didn't do anything except remain close enough to be there if he was needed. She thought it was the habit of many years. Inside, the apartment was larger than she had expected, and emptier than she had expected. High ceilings, old hardwood floors that had been refinished, no steps, no rugs. Every threshold had been sanded flat, and every doorknob had been replaced with a lever instead of one that needed to be turned. And Della stood in the middle of the living room and realized that the entire home had been taken apart and rebuilt around a wheelchair. There were no photographs on the walls, not a single one. Where most people would have no pictures, there was a bookcase, and the shelves were filled with books about shipbuilding, tides, and maritime law. Rafferty Malloy went into the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water from the faucet, and drank half of it before speaking. You should sit down, he said. There are things you need to hear before you unpack your suitcase. Della sat on the edge of the chair. She didn't have a suitcase. She had a cloth bag containing 3 changes of clothes and a toothbrush, and that bag was resting beside the door. My family has money, he said. I won't pretend otherwise. You've lived in Chicago long enough that you've probably heard the name Malloy somewhere. The harbor, the warehouses, the transportation companies, those belonged to my grandfather and my father. He set the glass down. 4 years ago, there was an explosion at Calumet Harbor, a cargo ship. I was aboard it. He said it in the same voice a person might use to read the weather. There was fire. After the fire came 11 months at Rush Hospital, and after those 11 months, my legs were like this. Della said nothing. She had learned in the Ashbury home that when someone was opening a box, it was best not to reach inside. A wealthy family can forgive many things, Rafferty Malloy said. It forgives gambling, it forgives drinking, It forgives 3 generations of divorce. What it can't forgive is a broken display piece. He looked up. They settled matters with me, a monthly allowance, this apartment, far away from the parties, far away from the photographs, far away from places where people might ask questions. And they asked me, as a favor, not to appear. Outside the window, an elevated train passed, the sound of iron wheels against the tracks growing distant and then fading away. So, he said, what you married was a monthly check and a man who can't stand up to greet you. That's all there is. If you want to tear up the paper we signed this morning, today will be the easiest day to do it. Tomorrow it'll be a little harder, and every day after that will become a little harder still. Della sat quietly. Then she asked, are you finished? Rafferty Malloy looked at her. Wasn't that enough? It's still more than what I brought, Della said. She stood. Show me where the kitchen is. A husband shouldn't go to bed hungry on his wedding night. A very long silence filled the room. Out in the hallway, Gideon Parr, who had been standing near the doorway and had overheard everything without intending to, turned his face away and stared at the blank wall for about 5 seconds. The kitchen was at the end of the hall. The countertops were about 6 inches lower than usual. Della opened 3 cabinets before she found a box of pasta, and the refrigerator contained 2 eggs, a jar of olives, and 4 sealed containers of delivered food with their labels still attached. How long have you been eating this? She asked. 3 years, dear God. She boiled the pasta. She cracked the 2 eggs into a bowl, and because there was no cheese, she used the white powder in a jar that she assumed was cheese, and she made something her mother had taught her to cook when she was 9 years old in a kitchen 3 times smaller than this one. Rafferty Malloy ate every bite. He didn't praise it. He simply finished everything, and when she stood to clear the dishes, he said, tomorrow Gideon will take you to open a bank account. No, he looked up. I'm still working, Della said, the night shift. The Argonne Room. 6 o'clock in the evening until 3 in the morning, 6 days a week. You just married a monthly allowance. You can keep your check. I'll pay my own way. Rafferty Malloy set down his fork. Do you know where that restaurant is? I know it better than anyone. 300 people watched you get thrown out of that building 4 days ago. You intend to walk back through the employee entrance and carry trays for those same people? Yes, why? Della turned on the faucet. Water ran into the sink for a moment before she answered. Because 4 years ago, a man sat across from me and promised to pay me, she said. And I believed him. I'm still paying the price for believing him today. She turned off the water. I don't take money from anyone anymore. It isn't because of you. I just don't do that anymore. Rafferty Malloy looked at her for a very long time, and he didn't argue, and he never raised the subject again throughout all the months that followed. The next night, at exactly 6 o'clock, Della Vasa swiped a new employee card at the rear entrance of the Ambassador Hotel. The night manager studied her for 3 seconds, then handed her a clean apron and told her that table 7 was waiting. No one asked any questions. No one there ever asked questions. And on Hoyne Street, inside the high-ceilinged apartment, with no photographs on its walls, a man sat in the darkness until nearly 2 o'clock in the morning, opened a phone, looked at it, then closed it again without calling anyone. Della reached Hoyne Street at 3:40 in the morning. The snow had stopped, and the cold that followed snowfall was clean and sharp, and she walked the 4 minutes from the elevated train station on 2 feet that had gone numb by the 7th hour of her shift. She took off her shoes at the door. She washed her face with cold water, because she didn't want the water heater running in the middle of the night. Then she lay down on the bed in the room at the end of the hallway, the room that had just been a storage room 4 days earlier, and she fell asleep in about 40 seconds. People said dreams lasted only a few minutes. This one lasted an entire lifetime. In the dream, she was standing on the roof of a building she somehow knew, even though the building had no name there. The wind blew sideways, the edge of the roof was directly behind her, and 4 people were pushing her toward it. Hollis Ashbury pushed with the flat of his palm, neatly, the way a person pushed a drawer closed until it fit perfectly into place. Cordelia pushed while she cried, and her tears ran down in 2 straight lines without disturbing so much as a trace of lipstick. Marguerite pushed with the tips of her fingers, barely touching her, as though she were only straightening a picture that hung crooked on a wall. Spencer pushed with both hands, with both shoulders, with the full weight of his body, and he pushed harder than any of the other 3, and there was nothing on his face. No anger, No satisfaction, nothing at all. He was simply a man finishing a task. And Della screamed his name. She screamed because that was the only way she had ever called him during those 14 months. Not softly, not in bed, but from the other end of a telephone at 2 o'clock in the morning when he hadn't come home, and shouting into a voicemail no one ever listened to. And there was a fifth person on the roof. He was there, standing alone against all four of them, and he held her wrist with both hands, and he wouldn't let go. The other four pushed harder. He still wouldn't let go. And when they threw her over the edge, his fingers didn't open. They didn't open even a little, and he fell with her. And in that instant of falling, Della saw his face clearly and understood that he knew exactly what was going to happen, and he still wouldn't let go. She woke because the light came on. Rafferty Malloy was in the doorway. She didn't know how long he had been there. There was nothing on his face. 3 days married, he said, and you're calling his name in my bed. Della sat up. Her hair clung to her neck. It took her about 4 seconds to remember where she was. Please, don't trouble yourself, he said. His voice was flat and polite, and colder than the sidewalk on Michigan Avenue. I know what you married. I have no illusions, but if you intend to call his name, call it quietly, so I don't have to hear it. That's all I ask. He turned his wheels. Wait, Della said. He didn't stop. Rafferty, he stopped. Before you add another row of bricks to that wall, she said, listen to me for 1 minute. He didn't turn around. But he didn't leave. In the dream, I was standing on a rooftop, Della said, for 4 people pushing me toward the edge. My father, my mother, my sister, and him. She drew in a breath. He pushed the hardest. Out of all 4 of them, he pushed the hardest. Rafferty Malloy turned his chair halfway back toward her. I screamed his name because that was the only way I ever called him, she said. 14 months. Do you know how many times I called his name? Into voicemail. At 2 o'clock in the morning. At 3 o'clock in the morning, standing by the window, watching the street to see whether any headlights would turn the corner. I never called his name normally, Rafferty, not once. I only ever screamed it. She looked at him. So when you hear me screaming his name in a dream, you're hearing exactly what those 14 months truly were. Not a love story. A woman standing there, screaming into the darkness. Outside the window, a garbage truck passed very slowly, and there was someone else on that roof, Della said. Rafferty Malloy remained silent. You were there, alone against all 4 of them. You held my wrist with both hands and you wouldn't let go. They pushed harder and you still wouldn't let go. And when they threw me over the edge, your fingers didn't open. Her voice broke only once, somewhere in the middle, then became steady again. You fell with me. You died beside me instead of standing there and watched me fall alone. The room was very quiet. It was a dream, Rafferty Malloy said. His voice was no longer flat, and he didn't know it. Then explain it to me, Della said. The city of Chicago has nearly 3 million people. Explain why my mind, when I'm asleep, the part of me I can't control, the part that can't lie, chose you, a man I've known for 4 days. As the only person who wouldn't let go of my hand, he didn't answer. He sat in the doorway without answering, and Della saw something move across his face before it was extinguished so quickly that later she wouldn't be certain she had seen it at all. Go back to sleep, he said. Then he reached out and turned off the light, and the wheels rolled across the hardwood floor and down the hallway, slowly growing fainter, and the sound stopped at the far end of the apartment, and it didn't continue into his room. It remained there for a very long time. Della lay in the darkness and listened to that stillness, and she understood that the man at the other end of the hallway had just heard something for which he had no place inside himself to keep. The Argonne Room kitchen closed its final table at 12:40, and after that it became an entirely different place. Half the lights above the hotline were switched off. 2 kitchen assistants played skid from a small speaker taped to a stainless steel shelf. Mrs. Roberta Kane. The head chef removed her apron, and for about 40 minutes she was no longer the woman who had spent 9 straight hours shouting over the sound of sizzling pans. She was simply a mother sitting at the steel table in the corner asking, Milo, are you finished yet? The boy had been sitting there since 10 o'clock. He was 8 years old, with curly hair and mismatched socks, one blue and one gray, and in front of him lay a math workbook open to a page with 12 multiplication problems. He had completed 9. Over the remaining 3, he had drawn a dinosaur. His school had closed for 3 days because the heating system had broken. The babysitter was unavailable, and Mrs. Roberta had no one else to leave him with, So he had spent 3 nights in a row sitting in the corner of the kitchen beside his mother, and everyone there treated him like part of the furniture. Della carried in the final tray at 10 minutes before 1. She set it down, removed her apron, dropped into the plastic chair across from the boy, and he looked up. "Miss Della, sing the song from last night." Mrs. Roberta didn't look up from the paper she was signing. "Milo, she's just spent 9 hours on her feet, I know." "Then you know what you're asking." "I know." Della smiled. It was the first time she had smiled in 7 days. "I didn't sing last night," she said. "You did." The boy sat up straighter. "You sang while you were stacking the glasses. You were singing very quietly, but I heard you. You always sing when you think no one is listening." Mrs. Roberta's pen stopped. She looked at Della, then returned her attention to the paper, and she said nothing, but she had heard it too. "Teach me," Milo said. "Teach me how to sing. I'm not a singing teacher. There's a singing teacher at school, but I'm not allowed to join. It costs $40. He said it the same way a person might talk about the weather, and Della saw Mrs. Roberta's shoulders stiffen slightly across the room before relaxing again. "All right," Della said, "but I'll only teach you one thing." "What?" "How to breathe." Milo looked at her as though she had tricked him. "I already know how to breathe." "No, you know how to stay alive. That's different." She pulled her chair closer. "Put your hand on your stomach." The boy placed his hand on his stomach. "Now breathe in, but don't let your shoulders rise. If your shoulders rise, you're breathing through your throat. If you breathe through your throat, you'll run out of air after 4 words. Milo inhaled. His shoulders rose all the way to his ears. One of the kitchen assistants laughed. "Hey," Milo said. "Sorry, kid, try again," Della said. He tried once more. On the 3rd attempt, his stomach expanded while his shoulders remained still, and his eyes widened as though he had just discovered a secret drawer hidden inside his own body. "Whoa, there," Della said. "Every song in the world begins right there. Sing 1 line, just 1 line. Then I'll go to sleep." Mrs. Roberta folded the paper. "He's lying. I hasn't gone to sleep before 2 o'clock all week, Mom." "Well, I'm telling the truth." Della sat quietly for a moment. The kitchen was very warm then, warm in the way only a kitchen could be, with steam still rising from the dishwashing station, and the little speaker playing something very softly until someone switched it off. Then Della sang 1 line. Only 1. It was a lullaby, slow and low, sung in the mountain English of another place, and no one in that kitchen knew the name of the song, and Adela didn't tell them. She sang it softly, at exactly the volume meant to soothe a child in a small room, not to fill a grand hall. When she stopped, no one applauded. The 2 kitchen assistants stood motionless beside the sink. Mrs. Roberta Kane sat at the corner of the table with the folded paper in her hand, and her eyes had grown red, though she didn't understand why, and she turned away to reach for a dish towel. Milo said very softly, "That was sad, yes, but it didn't make me sad." "That's right," Della said. "That's what a good song does." In the employee corridor, about 13 feet from the kitchen door, Rafferty Malloy was sitting in his wheelchair. He had come to take his wife home, as he had done every night for 6 nights, though he had never once gone inside. He waited in the corridor because the floor was level, because no one had to move tables or chairs for him there, and because he had no intention of entering any room where an 8-year-old child was sitting at 1 o'clock in the morning. He sat 13 feet from the doorway, and he heard everything. He heard the lesson about lifting the shoulders. He heard the boy laugh. He heard the line of the song. His hand rested on the rim of the wheel and remained there for the entire song, without moving even a single millimeter. And when the song ended, he still didn't move. He sat there for another 20 seconds. Then he turned his wheels, went back toward the rear exit, and reached the car before Della had finished putting on her coat. Gideon Parr opened the car door. He noticed everything, because that was his job, and he noticed that the man entered the car without saying a word. Della came out 4 minutes later. No one spoke during the entire drive back to Hoyne Street. She thought Rafferty was tired. She went to bed shortly before 4 o'clock. Rafferty Malloy didn't go to sleep. He sat in the darkened living room facing the window, where the yellow streetlight shone through curtains and cast a narrow stripe across the hardwood floor. That stripe moved very slowly. He sat there watching it move for 3 hours. Gideon Parr, who slept in the small room beside the front door, and who hadn't asked his employer a single personal question in 11 years, came out shortly before 6 o'clock in the morning to get some water. He saw the shadow in the living room. He stopped. "Are you all right, boss?" A long silence passed. No, Gideon Parr said his employer had an appointment at Rush at 2 o'clock on Thursday afternoon, and Della believed him because she had no reason not to. She worked the night shift, so the afternoons belonged to her, and he had gone to Rush on Thursdays for 4 years, and his gray wool coat still hung on the rack as it did every day. That afternoon, she picked up the leather wallet he had left on the kitchen table. His insurance card was inside. She called Gideon. Gideon didn't answer. She asked the receptionist at Rush, and they told her Mr. Malloy had no appointment that day, and that Mr. Malloy hadn't had an appointment there since the previous fall. Della stood at the corner of Hoyne Street with the wallet in her hand for about 30 seconds. Then she opened it. In the back compartment, behind the insurance card, there was a business card for an Italian restaurant on Taylor Street. No person's name. Only the name of the restaurant and its address, embossed on thick paper. She took the elevated train down there. The restaurant was called Sabatini, a small place with a wooden door and lace curtains, covering the lower halves of the windows. The kind of restaurant people passed 400 times without ever going inside. There were 8 tables within, and not a single customer, even though it was 3 o'clock in the afternoon and every restaurant across the street waved. A waiter came out to stop her. Della said, "I'm bringing my husband his wallet," and she held it out, and the waiter looked at the wallet, then at her face, and something in his expression changed, and he stepped back. He didn't lead her anywhere. He simply moved aside and stopped blocking her, and that was what made it frightening. She walked through the kitchen. At the far end was a door. She pushed it open about 8 inches and stopped there. The room beyond was larger than the entire restaurant, low ceiling, a long walnut table, and gathered around that table were 11 men, and all 11 of them were standing. There wasn't a single chair in the room. Every chair had been removed. Only one person was seated. Rafferty Malloy sat at the head of the table in his wheelchair, wearing a shirt without a tie, his hands resting on the armrests, and not one of the 11 other men dared sit because there was nothing for them to sit on. And Della understood in a single second that it wasn't an accident. The chairs hadn't been removed because there wasn't enough room. They had been removed so that, in that room, there would be only one man sitting. 2 men were speaking at once. One was young, with a buzz cut and a flushed face, was talking about a piece of property in Bridgeport, about a permit, and about how his father had invested money in it back in 1994. The other was older, with gray hair and a black suit. He didn't speak loudly, but he spoke at length, and he kept repeating the word fairness. They talked for about 4 minutes. Rafferty Malloy didn't interrupt them once. Then he lifted one finger from the armrest, only one. The entire room fell silent as though someone had flipped a switch. "The property will be divided in 2, he said. The section north of the tracks goes to the Cortese family. The section south goes to the Bevilacqua family." The man with the buzz cut opened his mouth. "I'm not finished," he closed it. "The permit remains in Bevilacqua's name, because that name has been on the city records for 19 years. And no one goes asking questions about a name that has been there for 19 years. Cortese takes the rent. Bevilacqua provides the signature." He paused for exactly 1 beat. "Whichever family takes this matter outside this room loses both shares," he lowered his finger. "Done." No one argued. Not one of those 11 grown men offered so much as half a word of protest, and Della stood behind the partially open door and watched all their shoulders drop at once. 11 pairs of shoulders, as though someone had just cut a rope stretched tight across the room. The gray-haired man approached the head of the table. He was about 65. He bent down, took the hand resting on the armrest, and pressed his lips to the back of it. Rafferty Malloy didn't pull his hand away. He didn't look at the man either. He looked directly toward the door. He looked straight at Della. And for exactly half a second, something passed over his face. Something Della would need months to name for, and then it vanished. And what remained was the face of the man at the head of the table. "Wait for me outside," he said. It wasn't the voice he used with his wife. It was the same voice he had just used with the 11 men. Della went outside. She stood on the Taylor Street sidewalk for 40 minutes, still holding the wallet, and she didn't feel cold at all. 3 weeks later, a man followed her from the damn and elevated train station until she was nearly back on Hoyne Street. Della didn't tell anyone. She changed her route, stayed near the well-lit areas, and when she got home, she mentioned it as though it were nothing while she washed the dishes. And Rafferty Malloy asked only one question: How tall was the man? Then another 3 weeks passed. On Saturday morning, Della was reading the Tribune at the kitchen table when she saw the man's name on page 11, 9 years, federal court. A case she read 3 times because the details didn't fit the man who had stood at Damlet Station. He didn't do this, she said. Rafferty Malloy was reading the sports section. No, you knew he didn't do it. Yeah, Della put down the newspaper. Her hand was trembling, and she hated that it was trembling. 9 years is 9 years of a person's life, Rafferty. Is his mother alive? Does he have children? Do you know? No, you don't know? Or he doesn't have any? I don't know, he said. I didn't ask. He folded the newspaper. He did it slowly, folding it in half, then into quarters, and placed it neatly along the edge of the table. Della stood there waiting for an explanation. Waiting for a but, a because, something she could hold on to and use to tell herself that she understood. Say something, she said. Rafferty Malloy looked up at her. Yeah, he said. For the 11 days after that newspaper appeared, the 2 people in the Hoingstraat apartment said exactly what needed to be said to each other, and nothing more. There was coffee in the morning. There was the sound of wheels rolling across the hardwood floor. There was a man waiting outside the employee corridor at 3 o'clock in the morning, and a woman getting into the car, and both of them sitting in silence for the entire 4-minute ride home. Della didn't know what she was angry about. She tried several times to give it a name in her mind, but it kept slipping away. She wasn't angry because he had power. She had stood behind that door on Taylor Street and watched 11 pairs of shoulders lower at the same moment, and she hadn't felt afraid then, and it was that very fact that frightened her afterward. She was angry because he wouldn't explain. Then she realized that wasn't it either. She was angry because she had waited for him to explain, and the waiting meant that some part of her still wanted to believe him, and 4 years earlier, she had promised herself that she would never again wait for a man to explain anything to her. On Tuesday morning, she came home from her night shift at 15 minutes before 4. The kitchen light was on. A cardboard box sat on the counter. It was small, square, and brown, the kind of box people use for screws or old receipts. There was no ribbon, no wrapping paper, no card. Della stood looking at it for about 5 seconds before touching it. She opened the lid. Inside was a piece of white tissue paper folded into quarters, and resting on it was a silver locket no larger than a coin, its chain coiled beside it, and around its edge ran an ugly line of solder made by the hand of someone who wasn't accustomed to such work. Della didn't pick it up at once. She placed both hands on the edge of the counter. Then her knees gave way, and she sank to the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet door, her apron still tied around her, and she held the locket in her palm without crying aloud. She only sat there breathing, the way a person breathes after running a very long distance without realizing they had been running at all. Wheels rolled to the doorway. Rafferty Malloy stopped there. He didn't come inside. Did you buy it back? Della asked. Her voice was broken. No. Then how did you get it? He was silent for a moment. Then he did something he had never done during the 7 weeks she had lived in that apartment, and something he wouldn't do many times again. He spoke at length. That night, they gave it to a security guard named Delaney, he said. Delaney turned it over to the head of security. The head of security sent it to the Ashbury family office, and 11 days later, it was sitting in a pawn shop on Milwaukee Avenue. The place is called Barrow & Sons. There are no sons, just a man named Barrow, 62 years old, who has rented that storefront since 2006. He spoke in the voice he used when reading the weather. I bought the pawn shop, not just the location. I bought the company that owned it, along with 3 other shops belonging to the same owner in Logan Square. Then I bought the building the shop rents. I bought it through a fund that doesn't have my name on it. Della looked up at him. Then I did nothing. He continued. I waited. 3 weeks later, Mr. Barrow received a notice about the following year's rent. He recalled the fund manager. The fund manager told him the rent would remain unchanged if the shop could prove that it operated cleanly, and to prove that every consigned item from the previous 6 months had to be reviewed. Anything without clear documentation of its origin had to be returned to where it came from. He paused. 3 days ago, Mr. Barrow brought it here himself. He didn't know whom he was bringing it to. He only knew it had to be returned. The refrigerator hummed for a moment, then fell silent. Why didn't you just pay for it? Della asked. You could walked in there, handed him $200, and brought it home. One afternoon, yeah, then why? Rafferty Malloy looked down at his hands. Because if I paid for it, it would become, he said. I would buy something and give it to you, and from that moment forward, it would be something I had given you. It would go on the list. The same list as a home, an opportunity, and a name to stand beside. He looked up. I didn't want it on that list. Della couldn't speak. It belongs to you, he said. It never belonged to them. It never belonged to Mr. Barrow. And it never belonged to me. So I didn't buy it. I only went and brought it back. She sat on the kitchen floor and closed her hand so tightly around the locket that the soldered edge pressed into her skin. And at the same time, somewhere very far back in her mind, a quiet and perfectly calm voice told her that this man had just purchased 4 stores and an entire building, and kept a 62-year-old man frightened for 3 weeks, all to recover a piece of silver worth $200, and that this was how he loved, and that he didn't know any other way, and that it wasn't a beautiful thing. She knew both truths at once. She sat on the floor and knew them both. I didn't open it, he said. I know. She turned the locket over. The solder ran all the way around its edge, a gray line of tin, thick in one place and thin in another, made by a woman who had borrowed a neighbor's soldering iron in West Virginia one summer afternoon and ruined it 3 times before finally getting it right. My mother sealed it, Della said. I was 16. I asked what was inside. She said there was one thing. What thing? She wouldn't tell me. Della placed the chain around her neck and fastened it behind her head, doing it slowly, in exactly the same way she had removed it before 300 people. She only said one sentence. Open it when you have nothing else left. Rafferty Malloy looked at her. 4 days ago you were sitting on the sidewalk in a rented wedding dress, he said. Why didn't you open it? Della placed her hand over the locket beneath her clothes. Because I still had something, she said. I just didn't know what it was yet. The video lasted 41 seconds and had been recorded from inside the glass, and the person holding the camera was Marguerite Ashbury. It appeared online 9 days after that snowy night. From an account no one could identify, and during those 41 seconds, people could see a woman in a wedding dress rising from the steps and saying something to a man in a wheelchair. Her words couldn't be heard. There was only the wind and the laughter of the person filming. By the 3rd week, it had crossed 4 million screens, and people argued beneath it about who she was, with half of them saying she was insane and the other half saying she was a gold digger, and not one of those 4 million people knew her name. Only one person did. Depla's phone rang at 11 o'clock on Friday morning, from a 304 area code. She was standing on the front steps with a bag of garbage still in her hand. Are you Della, Mrs. Voss's girl? The elderly woman's voice was thin, with a cough at the end of it. This is Hattie Pruitt. I lived across the road in Beckley. When you were little, you used to come over to my house for water. Della couldn't speak. I heard you talking in that video. I didn't recognize your face. Your face is all grown now, but I knew your voice right away. Then the old woman stopped, and when she spoke again, her voice had changed. Honey, 3 years ago I sent you a tape. You never listened to it? Della sat down on the step. You sent me what? Your mother's tape. I recorded it 3 days before she died. I mailed it right after the funeral, to that address in Chicago from the newspaper, with your picture in it, the picture of you standing beside those people. I thought you lived there. A long cough came through the line, then the sound of the woman setting down the phone, then picking it up again. I thought you'd already heard it. The copy arrived in the mail 5 days later, a small USB drive taped inside a sheet of graph paper. And on the paper were 3 trembling lines explaining that Hattie's grandson had transferred the recording from the old tape onto this, and that she had kept the original cassette in the drawer of her bedside table for 3 years because she hadn't known how to throw it away. Della plugged it into the computer at 2 o'clock that afternoon, alone in the room at the end of the hallway with the door closed. The first 9 seconds held nothing but the sound of the room, a fan, someone dragging a chair. Then Hattie's voice came from a distance, saying, Go ahead, Ruthie, it's running now. And Della's mother didn't speak. She didn't leave any final words. She gave no instructions. She didn't apologize. She didn't call her daughter's name. She sang. Della sat upright as though someone had shoved her in the back. She knew that melody. She knew it better than the route from the apartment to the elevated train station. Better than she knew her own face in the mirror, and she knew it because she had heard it every night for 18 years inside a wooden house in Beckley, West Virginia. and she had always believed it was something her mother had made up, the kind of thing a person hummed while washing dishes. But this wasn't a little tune. It had a structure. It rose, then fell, then rose higher. There was a place in the middle where the voice had to leap across a difficult interval, and her mother missed it, laughed once, then sang it again. The rhythm was wrong in places. Her voice was hoarse. She was so tired that parts of entire phrases disappeared, and it was the most complete thing Della had ever heard in her life. She listened to all of it, 4 minutes and 10 seconds. Near the end, her mother's voice became little more than breath, and she sang the final line with something that was if or truly a voice. Then there was silence, and then Hattie said, "That's enough, Ruthie. Stop now. That's enough." Della played it again. The second time, she didn't listen to the song. She listened to something else. She heard the breathing. She heard that after every 4 words there was a break, and that the break didn't fall at the end of a line the way it would for someone who was tired. It came in the middle of a word, sudden and sharp, like a door slamming shut. She heard the faint whistle at the beginning of every breath, the sound she had heard for 18 years and had mistaken for the sound of an old house. She heard the place where her mother laughed after missing the note, and she heard that the laugh had been cut in half too, and she understood that her mother hadn't laughed because anything was funny. She had laughed to find enough air. Della had an 8-year-old boy how to breathe properly 3 weeks earlier. She had told him that if his shoulders lifted, he was breathing through his throat, and if he breathed through his throat, he would run out of air after 4 words. Her mother had made it through 4 words. Della lowered the computer screen. She sat perfectly still for a very long time in the room at the end of the hallway. 19 years of night shifts at the coal processing plant off Route 3. Her mother had walked there at 10 o'clock at night and returned at 7 in the morning for 19 years. And she had never spoken about it, and when she began coughing, she said it was the weather, and when she began coughing up something else, she said it was because she had smoked when she was young, though she had never smoked a cigarette in her life. Adela had thought her mother's voice was rough because she was tired. She had believed that throughout her entire childhood. She opened the computer and played it a 3rd time, and this time she listened from beginning to end without moving, and she understood that what she was hearing wasn't a song. She was hearing a 47-year-old woman use the last strength units in her lungs to push out the one thing she still possessed that no one could take from her, and she had waited until 3 days before her death to do it, because before then, she had still needed to save enough breath to go to work. Della had listened to her mother die, and her mother had died inside a song. Outside in the hallway, the wheels stopped beyond the door and didn't knock. They remained there for a very long time, then rolled away. Della didn't leave her room until 6 o'clock that evening, and when she came out, she was wearing her uniform and she went to work, and she finished her entire shift, and she came home, and she said nothing. It went on that way for 9 days. On the 10th day, Rafferty Malloy was waiting for her in the kitchen at 4 o'clock in the morning with 2 cups of tea. He didn't ask about the recording. He already knew there was a recording, because Gideon Parr had signed for the package, and because nothing happened in that home without his knowing about it, and Della had understood that for a long time. 7 weeks, he said. You've lived here for 7 weeks, and you haven't mentioned your mother once. Not once. Della sat down. She held the cup of tea in both hands, but she didn't drink. I'm not asking because I'm curious, he said. I'm asking because I live with a woman, and I don't know which doors inside her are locked. Outside the window, the sky was still dark. The first elevated train hadn't begun running yet. I was 24, Della said. Then she was silent for about 10 seconds. Back then, I worked 2 jobs. In the mornings, I worked at the lunch counter in Beckley Appalachian Hospital, and at night, I cleaned the high school. My mother was lying on the 3rd floor of the same hospital where I worked. I went upstairs to see her during my 15-minute break. I was still wearing my apron. She looked down into the tea. She lay there for 4 months. Her insurance through the plant expired after the 2nd month because she had stopped working, and when people stop working, they lose their insurance. That was the rule, and no one had done anything wrong. In the 3rd month, I started receiving yellow notices. In the 4th month, I received a red one. There was always a red piece of paper in my coat pocket that I couldn't bear to unfold and read again because I had already read it once, and the number hadn't changed. Rafferty Malloy said nothing. Then a man came, Della said. He wore shoes no one in that entire town wore. He was there because of the plant. A fund in Chicago was buying up its debt, and that was his business, and while he was there, someone told him about a girl working 2 shifts at a hospital while her mother lay on the 3rd floor. She gave a very brief laugh, and there was nothing in it. He thought it was wonderful. Such a wonderful story. Outside, a garbage truck passed. He sat across from me at the counter where I worked, Della said. He ordered coffee and didn't drink it. He said, "My dear, I have a program. I'll bring you to Chicago. I'll give you a place to live. I'll give you an opportunity. And I'll take care of all your mother's hospital bills. Every one of them. Starting today. You'll never have to think about another red notice again." She set down her cup. Then he pushed a stack of papers toward me. Rafferty Malloy still didn't speak, but something in his face had hardened. "I asked my mother," Della said. "I went up to the 3rd floor and asked her. She was breathing through a tube. She listened to everything. Then she relaxed for like this, only one, and pointed toward the door. She pointed toward the door, Rafferty. She couldn't speak. She only pointed at the door and nodded over and over until I stood up." Della sat quietly. "I left the next day," she continued in an even voice, the voice people used when reciting something they had memorized. "My mother lived for another 11 months. He paid for 3. In the 4th month, the hospital called me, and I called his office, and they said the program was under review. In the 5th month, they said the program was being restructured. In the 6th month, they stopped saying anything at all. They simply stopped answering the phone, and I understood that they had already taken the photograph, and the photograph had already been published, and once the photograph had been published, no one needed the rest of the story anymore." Della looked up. "I started working nights at the Ambassador that month. I sent home a little at a time. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. One night carrying trays was worth 4 hours in that hospital room. I counted every night. I knew exactly how many hours of her life each one of my shifts could buy." She paused. "I was going home in October. I had bought a bus ticket. I kept it in a drawer." Rafferty Malloy asked very softly, "Did you go?" "No, the kitchen was so quiet that they could hear the refrigerator humming. I found out through a text message," Della said. "It was 2:00 on a Tuesday afternoon. Cordelia sent it. She wrote that Beckley Hospital had called the office because they couldn't reach me, that my mother had died that morning, and she sent me the telephone number for the funeral home." Della looked directly into his eyes. Then she added one more line beneath it. She wrote, "Don't let this ruin dinner tonight. We have guests." Rafferty Malloy didn't move, but the hand resting on his armrest tightened, and his knuckles turned white, and Della saw it, and she didn't stop. "I went to that dinner," she said. "That's what you need to know, Rafferty. Not the message. The message was simply Cordelia being Cordelia. Everyone is who they are. What matters is that I went. I showered, I dressed, I went downstairs. I poured wine for 8 guests, and I sat them, and in my pocket was the telephone number of a funeral home I hadn't called yet." She lifted the cup of tea, and then set it down. "My mother pointed toward the door, and I walked through it. That was the last thing she ever did for me, and I traded it for a promise from a man I had known for 40 minutes. The streetlight outside the window changed as the first elevated train passed. "So don't ever promise me anything," Della said. "Do whatever you're going to do. Just don't tell me beforehand. Don't tell me you're going to do something for me. Don't tell me everything will be all right. Don't tell me you'll take care of it. I wouldn't survive it a second time." Rafferty Malloy looked at her for a very long time. Then he spoke, choosing each word as carefully as a person stepping across thin ice. "I won't promise you anything." And throughout the months that followed, he kept his word. He never promised her a single thing. Not once, on the night of December 31st, the Argonne Room closed its final table at 12:20, earlier than usual, because the whole city had gone out to watch the fireworks and no one wanted to sit inside eating steak while they were going off. But by 10 minutes before 1, only 5 people and a radio remained in the kitchen. Mrs. Roberta Kane opened a bottle of wine that she claimed had been given to them by the restaurant, though everyone knew it hadn't. The 2 kitchen assistants had already gone home. Milo sat at the steel table in the corner, 8 years old, wearing one blue sock and one gray sock, and in front of him was a stack of white cloth napkins nearly as high as his chin that he was supposed to fold for the morning shift. He wasn't stacking them, he was shaping them, Miss Della. Look at this. He held up a swan. Its neck curved gracefully, its two wings spread open, and its head tilted slightly to one side. He had made it from a cloth napkin. "Good Lord," Della said. "Who taught you how to do that?" "Uncle Emile taught me last summer." Mrs. Roberta poured herself another half glass. "Emile worked here for 3 years before he retired. He taught Milo, and now the boy folds them better than I do." The kitchen door opened partway. Rafferty Malloy stopped at the threshold, and he was about to say something, probably that he would wait outside in the car, but Milo looked up before he could speak. "Mister, come in. Do you know how to fold a swan?" The entire kitchen went silent for half a second. Mrs. Roberta started, "Milo, honey." Adela had already pulled the chair at the head of the table out of the way without looking at anyone, pretending she was merely clearing the space. Rafferty Malloy looked at the boy. The boy looked back at him, and there was absolutely nothing in his eyes except a question about napkins. "No," Rafferty said. "Come here, I'll teach you." He came inside. The steel table was exactly the right height. Someone in that restaurant had installed it at that height 30 years earlier for an entirely different reason, and now it was exactly right, and no one said a word about it. "This is easy," Milo said in the voice of an expert. "You fold it in half." "No, the other way. Diagonally." Rafferty Malloy folded it diagonally, then fold both sides into the middle. Like a rocket, he folded both sides inward, then turn it over. He turned it over. It collapsed into a flat napkin. Milo laughed. "You turned it wrong. I did exactly what you told me. You turned it too fast." "You have to hold it here," he said, pressing one finger against a spot on the table. "Hold it here first, then turn it." The second one collapsed too. The third stood for about 2 seconds, then fell backward like a drunken man. Milo laughed so hard that he had to lower his face onto the table. Mrs. Roberta said, Milo in her mother's voice, but she was laughing too, and Della stood at the sink with a towel in her hand, having completely forgotten what she had been wiping. Rafferty Malloy made the fourth one slowly. He made it very slowly. He folded it in half diagonally, folded both sides to the center, held the exact spot where the boy had pressed his finger, and turned it over with great care. And it stood upright, and it had a neck, and it had 2 wings, and then its head sagged completely to one side and slowly folded down onto the table like a swan that had fainted. Milo shrieked. He laughed so hard that he slid off his chair and landed on the kitchen floor, sitting there with both arms wrapped around his stomach while pointing at the dead swan on the table, unable to form a complete sentence. "It's dead," he cried. "You killed it." And Rafferty Malloy laughed. It wasn't a polite laugh. It burst out of him, low and brief and entirely unexpected, and made both his shoulders shake, and he lifted one hand to cover his face as though the sound had startled him too. Della turned to look. She stood at the sink with the towel still in her hand, and watched her husband laughing in the Argonne Room kitchen at 1:10 in the morning on New Year's Day, and she realized that in 7.5 weeks she had never heard that sound before, and she didn't know where inside herself to put it. "Again," Milo said, climbing back onto his chair. "Do another one." They folded 9 more. The 7th stood perfectly upright. Milo placed it in the center of the table and declared that it was the leader of the flock. Mrs. Roberta poured Della half a glass, and Della drank half of that half, then stopped because she still had to walk to the train station. Through the high window on the kitchen wall came the distant, heavy sound of fireworks from the lake, like someone closing an enormous door very far away. No one went outside to watch. By nearly 2 o'clock, Milo had fallen asleep at the table with his head resting on his arm beside 11 swans. Mrs. Roberta took off her coat and draped it over him. 3 more nights and school will open again, she said softly, speaking to no one in particular. Then he'll go home at the proper time like everyone else. Gideon Parr stood at the kitchen door. He had been standing there for a long while. He always stood at doors. That had been his place for 11 years. He looked inside. He looked at the steel table, at the 11 napkin swans, at the woman smiling by the sink, at the man at the head of the table, using one finger to support the neck of the 12th swan so it wouldn't collapse. Gideon Parr had driven that man for 11 years. He had stood outside many doors. He turned his face away and stared at the white wall of the employee corridor, and he remained like that for about 5 seconds before turning back. On the drive home to Hoyne Street, the sky was clear, and the city was full of people walking home, and the car had to stop at nearly every intersection. Della sat in the back seat looking outside. "That leader swan," she said. "Yeah. It was the 7th one, I know. You ruined 6 before you made it, I know." Rafferty Malloy said. Then he added, while looking at the window on his side, it stayed standing. Della didn't answer. She sat in the back seat and smiled at the cold glass, and outside, Chicago was entering a new year, and in 4 months everything in her life would shatter into pieces. But not tonight. The letter arrived during the second week of January, handwritten on thick, cream-colored paper, and it contained only one line. Bring your wife to Sunday lunch. She didn't sign it. She didn't need to. Gideon Parr carried it into the kitchen and placed it on the table without saying a word, and Rafferty Malloy stared at it for about 10 seconds before saying, My grandmother. The house stood in Kenwood, built of gray brick behind a tall iron fence, and it had been there since 1921. The woman who opened the door was a housekeeper named Dorothea, who had worked there for 40 years, and she called Rafferty Malloy Master Rafe in the way someone might address a 10-year-old boy. The house smelled of floor wax and lilies. Della noticed 3 things as she crossed the foyer. First, there were no steps. Second, the long carpet in the hallway had been rolled up and propped against the wall. Third, a chair had been moved from the corner of the dining room, and 4 old indentations in the hardwood showed that it had stood in that exact place for decades. Beatrix Malloy sat at the head of the table. She was 84 years old. She was small, with a straight back and white hair gathered into a neat bun, and she wore a dark green cardigan with a worn place at one elbow that she hadn't bothered to conceal. She didn't rise. She merely held out one hand. Come here, child. Rafferty Malloy moved toward her. She took his face between both hands, turned it to the left, then to the right, and studied him exactly as someone might examine something they had planted themselves. She said. Your eyes are alive again, she released him. For 4 years, I've looked at you the way one looks at a withered tree in a pot. Someone has finally watered my tree. Then she turned her head, and her gray eyes settled directly on Della. And Della understood at once that the past 40 minutes had only been a formality. So you're the young woman who knelt before a wheelchair in front of the entire city of Chicago. Yes, Mom. I am. Sit down. Not in that chair. That leg has been loosened since Truman was in office. Lunch was roast chicken and potatoes, followed by an apple pie Dorothea had made that morning. Beatrix Malloy ate little and said little, and she didn't ask a single question until the plates had been cleared. Then she placed both hands on the table. People say you married my grandson with empty hands, she said. Do they? Della replied. They say much more than that. I'm 84 years old, child. People tell me everything because they think I'm deaf. She stared at Della without blinking. Is it true? Della set down her fork. Mom, my hands weren't empty, she said. They were holding my entire heart. Chicago simply couldn't see it. The grandfather clock in the foyer ticked through the silence of the dining room. Beatrix Malloy said nothing for about 5 seconds. Then she turned toward her grandson. Rafferty, yes, Mom. Did you hear what she just said? I heard. Do you understand what you've just been given? I do. No, you don't, she said. The men in this family never understand until they've lost it. She stood. She rose slowly, bracing both hands against the edge of the table, and Dorothea took half a step forward before stopping when Beatrix raised one finger. She left the room. She was gone for 3 full minutes. When she returned, she carried a small box covered in velvet at tail corners. She placed it in front of Della and opened the lid. The ring inside wasn't beautiful in the way people usually thought of jewelry. It was heavy. The gold had deepened to the color of honey, and the emerald at its center bore a scratch across the surface that no one had bothered to polish away, while the band had been worn flat underneath after decades of resting against human palms. This entered the Malloy family before this country bore the name it carries now, Beatrix Malloy said. My husband's great-grandmother wore it, then my mother-in-law, then me. 61 years. She looked at Della. It doesn't follow the eldest son. It doesn't follow the family name. It doesn't follow the money. In this house, it follows one rule, and that rule was made by women, and the men have no say in it. She pushed the box forward an inch. It belongs to the woman with the steadiest hands. Della didn't reach for it. Mom, I have nothing, she said. I know, Beatrix Malloy replied. Neither did I in 1961. I was 19 years old, working at the ticket counter of a movie theater on 63rd Street, and my mother-in-law cried for 3 nights when she heard the news. That old woman called me the ticket girl for 4 years. She picked up the box, then took Della's hand, and her own hand was light and dry and remarkably firm. Then she gave me this before she died. She said she had been wrong. She slid the ring onto Della's finger. It fit. It fit with complete and unreasonable perfection. "I don't hand this out like candy, child," Beatrix Malloy said. "I held it for over 60 years. I could have given it to 3 people, and I didn't. I waited." She kept Della's hand inside her own. "That night, the entire city laughed at you. I watched that video 7 times. Do you know what I was watching?" "No, Mom." "I wasn't watching you," Beatrix Malloy said. "I was watching my grandson. For 4 years, no one in this family has stepped within 3 paces of that boy. No one. Not even me. Especially not me." She released Della's hand. There was something very strange in her voice then, and Della heard it without understanding it, and she wouldn't understand it for many months. Then a strange young woman, soaked through and knowing no one, knelt on a sidewalk and moved closer to him. She sat down. She lowered herself very slowly. "I sat in this house for 6 years and couldn't do what a stranger managed to do in 4 hours. Beatrix Malloy reached for her napkin and wiped her hands, though they weren't dirty. "So you wear it," she said, "and you never take it off. Not even after you learn the things about this family that you're going to learn." In the foyer, the grandfather clock struck 2. Beatrix Malloy's 85th birthday celebration was held at the Kenwood House itself on the first Saturday evening in April, and 300 people came, and half of them came for her, while the other half came because this was the first time in 20 years that the Malloy family had opened its doors to anyone who didn't carry the Malloy name. Chairs had been arranged in the music room. A grand piano and an accompanist had been hired. Beatrix sat in the front row wearing her dark green cardigan, with Dorothea standing behind her, and she had told the organizers that she wanted no speeches, no cake, and whoever wished to sing could sing, and she would listen. Della didn't know who had invited the Ashburys. Later she would learn, and the knowledge would chill her. But that night she only stood at the back of the room beside her through a third row in an ivory outfit, and she thought, they can still walk free. The FBI investigation is still going, and they can still walk free. And she understood that in this city, people only died when they ran out of money, not when they ran out of honor. The master of ceremonies stepped forward. He said that, in celebration of Mrs. Malloy, a young Chicago vocalist would perform an original composition. Marguerite Ashbury walked out. She was beautiful. She was always beautiful. She took her place beside the curved side of the piano, waited until the whispering had completely faded, then spoke into the small microphone on its stand. "Mrs. Malloy, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to sing a piece I composed myself. I call it Song for the Departed." The accompanist played the opening 4 measures. Della knew those 4 measures. She had heard them every night for 18 years inside a wooden house in Beckley, West Virginia. Marguerite sang. She sang well. Her technique was clean. Her breath was strong. She didn't miss a single note, and she finished the first section, paused and lowered her head, and 300 people applauded, and someone in the 4th row murmured, "My God, did that girl write it herself?" Della stepped out from the back row. She walked into the aisle and spoke, not loudly, only loud enough for the front row to hear, and in a room full of applause. A quiet voice was the thing that made people turn their heads the fastest. That song was stolen. The applause stopped as though cut with scissors. Marguerite stood beside the piano. Her face didn't change. "Who is that girl?" "That's her sister. The one from the video. My God. She's having another episode." Cordelia Ashbury rose from the 3rd row. "Della," she said, her voice sweet as sugar, "today is Mrs. Malloy's day. Please?" Della didn't look at her. She looked at her sister. "That song isn't yours," she said, "and it isn't new. It already has a name, and it isn't the name you just gave it." She turned toward the 300 people. "It has 2 parts." No one in the music room moved. "The first part is the introduction. Slow, beautiful, easy. You've just heard it. The second part begins immediately after that, and it's in a different range, and it's difficult, and it's the reason the song exists." She looked at Marguerite. "For 4 years, you've sung this piece at 8 parties in this city. I carried trays at 3 of those 8. You've never sung beyond the first part." "Not once." Della took another step. "Has anyone here ever wondered why?" "Because a thief can only carry away what fits through the window." Marguerite laughed. It was a short laugh, and it broke in the middle. "She's insane," she said to the room. "Someone take her outside, someone." "Sing it," Della said. "What? Sing the second part." "Right here. You don't need the piano. You wrote it, didn't you? If you wrote it, you can sing it." Marguerite Ashbury stood frozen beside the grand piano before 300 people, her lips parted in a silent, empty gasp. Della turned her back on her. She walked to the front of the room and stood in the empty space beside the piano, and she didn't touch the microphone, and she said to the accompanist, "You don't need to play anything," then she sang. There was no nose music. There was nothing beneath her voice to carry it. Her voice entered in a low register, much lower than Marguerite's, and it wasn't beautiful in the way people in rooms like that usually used the word beautiful, and during the first 4 measures, several people glanced at one another. Then came the leap. The melody rose, and it kept rising, and it climbed past the place where the human ear expected it to stop, and it didn't stop, and the entire room drew one breath at the same time, all 300 people, and Della held the note there without the slightest tremor, then let it fall, slowly, all the way down, and that descent sounded like a door closing very softly inside an empty house. In the front row, Beatrix Malloy raised one hand to her mouth. Della sang the entire second section, 4 minutes and 10 seconds. When she stopped, no one applauded. Not one person. 300 people sat inside the Malloy music room and did nothing at all, and it was the loudest applause that room had ever heard. Then a chair scraped backward in the second row. An elderly woman stood. She wore simple black clothing with a white collar and leaned on a cane, and Della didn't know who she was. Half the room did. "Forgive me, Mrs. Malloy," the old woman said. "I have to say one thing, or I'll carry it to my grave." She turned toward the 300 guests. "My name is Annette Calloway. I taught voice for 40 years at the Northwestern Conservatory. During those 40 years, I taught senators' daughters, professors, and 2 people you now pay money to hear perform." She paused, and in those 40 years I encountered genius exactly once. She looked down at her cane. "Not in Chicago, not in New York, in a mining town in West Virginia. 23 years ago, when I went there to teach a summer program for a church because I lost a bet." The room remained silent. "And the person I met wasn't a child," Annette Calloway said. "She was a 27-year-old woman who worked the night shift at a coal plant. I heard her singing in the churchyard at 6 o'clock in the morning, and what she sang was unlike anything I had ever heard anyone compose. And I asked where she had studied, and she said she had never studied anywhere. She lifted her head. I asked her to come to Chicago with me. I asked her 3 times over the summers. She said no because she had a small child and no one to care for her." Someone drew in a breath in the 4th row. 4 years ago, Annette Calloway said, "A wealthy family in this city asked me to accept their daughter as a student. I heard that the girl sing. I refused. She had fingers, breath, everything, and nothing inside her at all." She turned her head toward Marguerite Ashbury. "Then I learned which family it was," she said, "and I accepted. I didn't accept because of that girl. I accepted because I had read the newspapers, and I knew there was someone else in that house whom they kept hidden on the 3rd floor. She looked at Della. "I thought that if I could pass through one open door, then perhaps one day I might reach the other." She straightened herself against her cane. "For 4 years, I sat in the Ashbury living room every Wednesday," she said, "and not once did they allow me to meet you." Then she turned toward Marguerite, and her voice wasn't loud, and it didn't need to be. "Marguerite Ashbury, in front of all these people, you aren't my student. From this night forward, never speak my name again." 3 weeks after that night, Marguerite Ashbury rang the bell of the ground-floor apartment on Hoyne Street at 10 o'clock on Tuesday morning. Gideon Parr looked through the window before opening the door, and he looked longer than usual because he didn't recognize the person standing outside. She wasn't wearing any makeup. That was the first thing Della noticed when she came to the door. In the 3 years Della had lived in the Ashbury house, she had never once seen her sister's face without something on it. Not even at 6 o'clock in the morning, not even when she was sick. Now there was nothing at all, and her face looked younger and older at the same time. There was no lawyer standing behind her, no car waiting at the curb. She had taken the elevated train. "I'll speak for 5 minutes," Marguerite said. "Then I'll leave." Della left the door open. She didn't invite her inside. Marguerite stood on the threshold, holding her handbag in both hands like a child clutching a school bag. "I didn't steal that," she said. Della didn't answer. "I know you don't believe me. I don't need you to believe me. But I've been sitting in that house for 3 weeks, and I haven't been able to say this to anyone, and if I don't say it aloud, wait and kill me." She drew in a breath. "Father gave it to me." Wheels sounded in the hallway behind Della. They stopped several feet away and came no closer. 3 years ago, Marguerite said, in November. I had just failed my third audition that year. He called me into his study and placed a tape recorder on the desk, one of those old ones, and told me to sit down and listen. She looked at the floor. He said, "You have to memorize this." He said, "This is what will open every door in this city for you." Della still said nothing. I asked whose it was. Marguerite looked up, and her eyes were dry, and that was worse than if she had been crying. He said it didn't belong to anyone. He said someone had mailed it to the wrong address, an old tape in a package with no return address, probably sent to the office by mistake, and no one would ever come looking for it. She began speaking faster, as though she knew she wouldn't be able to continue if she stopped. I asked him again. I did ask again, Della. Only once, I said, "Father, what if someone comes looking for it?" And he looked at me the way he looked at people across a boardroom table, and he said, "Marguerite, you're 26 years old, and you haven't earned a single dollar in your entire life. How many more questions are you planning to ask me?" Della stood perfectly still. "I memorized it in 2 weeks," Marguerite said. "Only the first part. The recording kept fading in the second part. I thought the old tape was damaged. I thought whoever recorded it had stopped halfway through. For 4 years, I believed the tape was broken." She gave a laugh, and it was an ugly sound, until I stood in that music room and heard you keep singing. A bus braked outside. "You think I'm a thief," Marguerite said. "I'm not a thief, Della. At least a thief knows what she's holding." Her fingers tightened around the handles of her bag. I was a speaker. My father turned me on, and I sang. 3 years, 8 parties. I stood there, bowed my head, accepted the flowers, stood exactly where people told me to stand, and sang exactly what they put inside me. Della opened her mouth. Then she closed it again, because what she had been about to say wasn't true. "You knew I worked nights there," she said. "At 3 of those 8 parties, I was carrying trays. You saw me, I saw you. You didn't say anything, I didn't say anything." Marguerite looked directly at her. "What did you expect me to say? Hello, little sister, I'm singing a song when I don't know who wrote it, inside the house where you aren't allowed to come downstairs for dinner. What did you want me to do?" She shook her head. "I'm not defending myself. I know what I am. I slept with the man who was about to marry my sister, and I signed my name on that account, and I did both because my father told me that if I did, everything would be all right." She drew in a breath, and this time it trembled. "I'm 29 years old, and I've just realized that nothing in my life has ever belonged to me. Not even my voice. Not even that." 3 weeks earlier, Della had stood before 300 people and said that a thief could only carry away what fit through a window, and she had believed every word of it. And now she stood on the threshold of her own home and realized she had been wrong. No one had climbed through a window. A man had opened the front door, walked inside, picked something up from a table, and handed it to his daughter as casually as he might hand her the keys to a car. "That tape was sent to me," Della said. Her voice sounded strange. "It wasn't sent to the wrong address. It was mailed to the address printed beneath the newspaper photograph of me. That was the only way she knew how to find me." Marguerite Ashbury stood on the threshold and understood it at that very moment, right there in front of Della, and Della watched the realization move across her face. She took half a step backward. 3 years, Marguerite said. She wasn't speaking to Della. It sat in his desk drawer for 3 years. She turned away. She took 3 steps, then stopped on the sidewalk without looking back. "I didn't come here to ask you to forgive me," she said. "I don't think there's any forgiveness like that for me." Then she walked toward the damn elevated train station alone, without makeup, and Della stood in the doorway watching until she disappeared around the corner. Behind her, the wheels rolled forward twice. "Are you all right?" Rafferty Malloy asked. Della didn't turn around. "For the past 4 months, I've been hating the wrong person," she said. Della had noticed that room during the 2nd week. It stood at the end of the hallway, opposite her room, and its door was an old wooden one with a pane of frosted glass in the upper half, the kind installed in offices during the 1930s. During the day, it remained open. Inside was a low table, a lamp, and 3 drawers she had never opened. At night, it was locked. Not every night. Over 4 months, she had counted 19 nights, and she had recognized the pattern by around the 8th one, and the pattern was that there was no pattern at all. It came when the weather was about to change. It came after days when he had spent too long in the chair. It came on nights when nothing had happened at all. She had asked him once during the second month, and he told her he worked late, and she had left it alone because she had doors of her own. Then, one night near the end of April, Della came home from her shift at 3:40 in the morning, and she heard glass break. It wasn't loud. That was what made her stop in the middle of the hallway, with her coat still resting on her shoulders. A loud crash meant something had been dropped. This sound was a glass being crushed inside someone's hand until it couldn't endure the compressor anymore. Rafferty. Nothing. She walked to the door. Light glowed behind the frosted glass, the dull yellow light of the desk lamp, and there was a shadow inside that didn't move. Rafferty, open the door. Go to bed, Della. His voice was flat. It was flat in the way a rope pulled to its could still be here perfectly straight. Open the door. I'm not opening it. She placed her palm against the wooden door. Your hand is bleeding. That's my business. Rafferty, Della. And this time his voice broke, only on that one word, in one very small place in the middle of her name. And Della heard that fracture, and her entire body went cold. Please, go away. I'll come out in the morning. I'll come out in the morning and everything will be the same as before. Just go tonight. Please. Della stood in the hallway for about 3 seconds. She thought of an elderly woman pointing toward the door from a hospital bed and nodding until Della had risen and left. She had gone. She had obediently walked through that door when she was 24, and she had lost 11 months and spent the rest of her life paying for it. She looked at the frosted pane. She removed her coat, wrapped it around her fist, and struck the glass. It shattered on the second blow. A shard pierced the fabric and cut the back of her hand, and blood ran down her wrist, and she didn't look at it. She reached through the opening, found the latch, and unlocked the door from inside. Rafferty Malloy was in the middle of the room. He wasn't sitting upright. He was folded forward in his chair, one forearm braced against the low table, and every muscle in his back was tightening at once and refusing to release, and sweat ran down his temple even though the room was cold. Shards of a broken glass lay across the floor. He raised his head and saw her, and the first thing that crossed his face was pain. It was shame. Get out, he said. Della stepped inside and closed the door behind her. Della, get out, no. She knelt beside the chair. Don't touch me, I'm not touching you. She didn't touch him. She only knelt there at the level of his eyes and placed both hands on her thighs, one of them bleeding while she ignored it. Let it pass, she said. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. Just let it pass. It passed in 14 minutes. During those 14 minutes, neither of them spoke. Twice he raised a hand and covered his mouth, and Della understood that this was a habit formed over 4 years. A man training himself not to make a sound, and that hurt her more than anything she had ever seen in her life. When it released him, he breathed like a man who had just broken through the surface of deep water. He didn't look at her. 4 years, he said. His voice was very hoarse. For 4 years I've done this inside locked rooms. At the hospital, there were curtains. Here, there's a door. I planned all of it, Della. I chose this room because it's at the far end of the apartment. I replaced this door last year because the old one was too thin. He wiped his face with one hand. I don't let anyone see this. I don't let my grandmother see it. I don't let Gideon see it, and Gideon has driven me for 11 years. Why? Because my family threw me away when all I had done was sit down, he said. Can you imagine what they would do if they saw this? Della knelt on the hardwood floor among the broken glass and looked at him for a very long time. Listen to me, she said. Those rooms are over. He looked up. From tonight forward, there won't be a single door in this home closed against me. Not one. You don't have to be silent. You don't have to cover your mouth. If you need to scream, then scream, and I'll sit here, and I won't go anywhere. She looked directly into his eyes. This thing comes for you at night like an army, and you've fought it alone for 4 years. From tonight forward, there are 2 of us. We fight it together, and we'll win. Rafferty Malloy looked down at her hand. You're bleeding, I know. Why did you do that? Della raised the back of her hand. The blood had begun drying around the edges of the cut. Because that glass was the lock, she said. It was the only thing that could open this door. She lowered her hand. You've been telling me I'll run. You told me that on the first night, and you've said it with your eyes every day for 4 months. She tilted her head. I just punched through a door to get in here. Does that look much like running? He couldn't say anything. He sat in his chair in the room at the end of the hallway, with his wife kneeling on the floor among shards of glass, and he reached out one hand and took hold of her uninjured wrist, and he held it between both of his hands. He held it very tightly. He didn't say a word. The next morning, Gideon Parr came to replace the door. He brought a new solid wooden door without any pane of glass. Della looked at it for about 5 seconds. "Take it back," she said. "Mom, take it back, Gideon. Cut the entire doorway out of the frame, too." He looked at her. Then he looked over her shoulder into the hallway, where his employer was sitting without saying a word. "Yes, Mom," Gideon Parr said. From that day forward, there was no door at the end of the hallway. There was only an empty frame. It remained there until the two of them moved out of that home, and neither of them ever mentioned it again. Spencer Holloway testified during the second week of May in exchange for 28 months instead of 9 years. And in that testimony, there was one sentence no newspaper printed because it had nothing to do with the pension fund. The sentence that said that Ashbury Capital had made an off-the-books in payment in the autumn 4 years earlier, and that the money had left the company through a consulting contract that involved no consulting at all, and Spencer didn't know where it had gone. He only knew Hollis Ashbury had signed it by hand instead of sending it through the finance department, and that it was the only time in 6 years he had ever seen him do such a thing. Della's lawyer sent her the testimony because she was an interested party. She read it at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. She read it again at 10 minutes past 2. Then she went into the room at the end of the hallway, the room without a door, and pulled open the third drawer. She hadn't opened any of those 3 drawers in 6 months, not because she had been forbidden. No one had forbidden her anything in that home. Inside the third drawer was a brown file folder, and inside the folder were 2 things. The first was a photograph. It had been taken from above at a slight angle, from the perspective of a camera mounted in the corner of a restaurant ceiling. A date was printed in the lower right corner, from the autumn 4 years earlier. In the photograph was a round table covered with a white cloth. 2 men were seated there. Della recognized the man on the left immediately because she had poured wine for him for 3 years. Hollis Ashbury. She didn't know the man on the right. He was about 55, with salt and pepper hair, and he had that chin, the chin she had looked at across the breakfast table every morning for the past 6 months. She turned the photograph over. On the back was a handwritten line, not in Rafferty's handwriting. Desmond Malloy. Sabatini. Table 4. Della sat down on the floor. She remained there for a very long time, fitting the pieces together, and she did it slowly because every time one piece fell into place, something inside her dropped another level. Autumn, 4 years earlier. Money leaving Ashbury Capital. Authorized by hand. 2 men sitting at table 4. Less than 2 months later, a ship at Calumet Harbor. And during that same month, at a hospital lunch counter in Beckley, West Virginia, a man wearing shoes no one else in that town wore sat down across from the 4-year-old girl and said, "My dear, I have a program." The photograph in the Tribune had been published on November 19th. Della remembered the date because she had clipped the article and mailed it home to her mother. The police had opened the investigation into the explosion on November 17th. He hadn't taken her in. He hadn't sponsored her. He had bought a beautiful story and placed it on page 4 of the Tribune. During the very week, people began asking where his money had gone, and in that photograph she stood beside him, wearing a borrowed sweater, believed she had been rescued. She had been the public face. She had been the cover for the very crime that had crippled the man she now lived with. The second thing inside the folder was a thick stack of stapled papers. The first page bore a date, 3 weeks before her wedding. It was the file an anonymous source had sent to the Chicago FBI office regarding money laundering through the Ashbury Capital Pension Fund. Della turned to page 9. A list of the individuals whose names appeared on the account: Marguerite Ashbury, Spencer Holloway, Delphine Voss. She stood and walked into the hallway, and he was there, and she understood at once that he had been there for a long time and had never intended to stop her. "You gave them my name, yeah. 3 weeks before you met me. Yeah, then you married me, 3 days later." Della held the papers in her hand and they trembled. "Did you take my name off the list?" "No, 6 months. 6 months," he said. "Your name is still there. It's still there today. Why?" "Because if I call them and tell them to remove one name from that list," Rafferty Malloy said, "the first thing they'll ask is why. And the answer to that question will kill you faster than any sentence they could ever hand down." Della set the papers down. She picked up the photograph. "What is this?" "You already know what it is. How long have you known?" 4 years. She looked at him. Then she asked the question whose answer she had known from the moment she turned the photograph over, and she asked it because she needed to hear it in his voice. 4 years ago, she said, did you give any orders concerning me? Outside the window, an elevated train passed. It went all the way by. Then there was silence. Yes, Rafferty Malloy said. Della didn't move. I had a list, he said. It contained everyone who stood close to Hollis Ashbury during that month. You were the 11th name. I didn't know who you were. I only knew your face appeared beside his on page 4 of the Tribune, 3 weeks after he signed that payment. He paused. Then I looked at the photograph. She waited. All 300 people in that photograph were smiling, he said. You were looking at the floor. He looked down at his hands. I canceled the order within 3 days. And I kept that photograph for 4 years, and even now I still don't understand why I kept it. Della Voss stood in the hallway for a very long time. Then she went into her room, took out the cloth bag, and placed 3 changes of clothes inside it, and no one stopped her. She passed him in the hallway and paused for exactly 1 second. You never promised me anything, she said. No, thank you for that. Then she walked out the door. Mrs. Roberta Kane didn't ask a single question. She merely cleared the sofa in the living room and said the bathroom was at the end of the hallway, and the hot water took 3 minutes. Della stayed there for 3 days. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, the sun was shining, and Milo came home from school at 4 o'clock and entered the living room with his backpack still on, while his mother stood in the kitchen doorway wiping her hands on her apron and watching him. Miss Della. Listen to me sing, he sang the lullaby. He got nearly all the words wrong. He replaced 3 of them with 3 others he thought fit better, and when he reached the difficult leap, his voice cracked and he laughed, and his mother laughed, and Della laughed too, and it was the first sound she had made in 3 days. You sang almost all of it wrong, I know, Milo said. Then he dropped down beside her on the floor and said, Miss Della, yes, you said every song has a second part. Yes. He looked at her. Where is your second part? Della Voss sat still for about 4 seconds. Then she stood up. She didn't return to Hoyne Street right away. She took the elevated train down to the Loop and sat for 2 hours at the Harold Washington Library with the photograph in her bag, searching the newspaper archives for the name Desmond Malloy. And she found 6 articles. 4 were society notices. 1 was the obituary of Rafferty Malloy's father, which included a line saying that his younger brother, Desmond, had read the scripture at the funeral. The 6th was an 8-line report about the explosion at Calumet Harbor, and in those 8 lines, the word investigation didn't appear once. By 6 o'clock that evening, she knew what she needed. She needed to find the mechanic. She went back to retrieve the file. Mrs. Roberta's car was parked in the underground garage beneath the office building, where she worked an extra morning shift on the 2nd basement level, and she had given Della the keys and told her to take it, saying she could ride the train instead. At 7 o'clock that evening, the 2nd basement level held 4 cars and 3 fluorescent lights, and one of those 3 was flickering, and the flicker made a sound, a small click every 9 seconds. Della passed pillar number 7. She heard the shoes before she saw the man. He was behind her, about 16 feet away, and he wasn't trying to hide, and that made her understand immediately, because a man planning to steal a purse moved quietly. This man didn't need her not to hear him. This man wanted her to hear him. She didn't turn around. She kept walking, then changed direction, moving not toward Mrs. Roberta's car, but diagonally toward the emergency exit in the corner. And she pulled the keys from her pocket and wedged the longest one between index finger and middle finger. The way a woman who had worked night shifts for 3 years in the city, learned without anyone having to teach her. The footsteps changed direction with her. Then there was a 2nd pair of shoes. They were ahead of her. Della stopped 2 rows of cars. The man in front stepped out from behind a pillar. He was large, wearing a black coat, and he held nothing in his hands, and he said, Mrs. Malloy, he only wants to talk. 3 clicks from the light. Who? You'll find out when you get in the car. No, Mrs. Malloy. My name is Voss, Della said. Then she threw the cloth bag into his face and ran. She made it about 13 feet. The man behind caught her arm at the elbow, and Della didn't pull away. She did the opposite. She turned into him and drove the key down into the back of his hand. He released her. She heard him suck in a breath. She backed up 3 steps, and her back struck the concrete wall, and on that wall, level with her shoulder, was a red glass case with a fire extinguisher inside. The first man was coming toward her. Della drove her elbow into the glass. It shattered. She pulled out the extinguisher, and it was heavier than she had expected. So heavy it nearly dragged her to the ground, and she didn't lift it. She didn't have the strength to lift it. She pulled the pin, squeezed the handle, and swept it from side to side. The entire basement turned white. Powder burst out in a thick cloud, struck the low ceiling, and folded back down. And for 2 seconds, no one could see anything, not even Della. There was coughing. Someone kicked a car. The extinguisher struck the concrete floor and rolled away. Della stood inside the white dust with her back against the wall, and she did the one thing neither of those men had expected, and not even something she herself had planned. She screamed. She didn't scream for help. She didn't scream any word at all. She opened the thing her mother had left inside her, the thing an old woman in West Virginia had used the final strength of her lungs to push into the world, and she hurled it upward at the concrete ceiling less than 7 feet above her head. Concrete didn't absorb sound. Concrete returned it down. The sound struck the ceiling, crashed down against the floor, struck the walls, multiplied, traveled the entire length of the second basement level, and came back. And for 4 seconds it was no longer one woman screaming. It was the entire basement screaming. The alarms of 2 cars began blaring. Above them, on the first level, there were footsteps running toward the stairs. Someone near the exit ramp called down and asked what was happening. The first man cursed. Then came the sound of running shoes, moving toward the vehicle ramp and away from her, and the second set followed. 7 seconds later, a car turned down the ramp into the basement too quickly and braked hard across the concrete covered in white dust. Gideon Parr was out of the car before it had completely stopped. He didn't say anything. He stood there inside the cloud and looked Della over, from head to foot for exactly 3 seconds. The look of a man who had done this work for 11 years and was counting. Then he opened the rear door. "Get in the car, Mom." Della got in. The building's cameras had recorded everything. 9 minutes and 40 seconds. There was no sound because that camera had no microphone. But beside pillar number 7 was a wall-mounted intercom connected to the security office, and the line had been left open because someone on the first level had pressed it after hearing the noise, and that call had been saved. By 10 o'clock that night, both recordings were on the table at Hoyne Street. Rafferty Malloy watched the video first. He watched all 9 minutes and 40 seconds without saying anything. Then he opened the audio file. There was coughing, the sound of the extinguisher rolling, then the scream. It came through the small computer speaker, distorted and distant, and it still made the glass of water on the table tremble slightly. Gideon Parr stood in the doorway. He had stood in doorways for 11 years. Rafferty Malloy listened to the entire recording. He listened to all 4 seconds, then he shut off the computer. He didn't say a word. He didn't ask anyone anything. He didn't turn toward Gideon. He reached for the telephone on the table, the black telephone Della hadn't seen him use once during the past 6 months, and dialed a number. It rang twice. Someone answered on the other end and said nothing. "Call everyone back," Rafferty Malloy said. "Tomorrow night." Then he put down the phone. He did it very slowly. His hand lowered it onto the tabletop without making a sound, and he left his hand resting there for another moment, and inside the room at the end of the hallway, where there was no door, no one said anything more. Della stood in the empty frame. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Rafferty Malloy didn't turn around. "I don't promise you anything," he said. The name took 4 months to find. Della began with the personnel records of the harbor maintenance company from that year. But that company had been dissolved, and the company that acquired it had also been dissolved, and she spent 6 weeks merely discovering that their last surviving employment files were stored in a warehouse in Cicero, owned by a retired bankruptcy. She went there 4 times. On the 4th visit, he allowed her inside. There were 14 names in the valve and pressure inspection department. 13 of those people were still in Illinois. The 14th was named Wendell Trask, and he had left Chicago in February of the year after the explosion without leaving a forwarding address. Della found him in a way no investigator would have considered. She searched for his wife. Men disappeared, but women renewed their library cards. Mrs. Loretta Trask had registered for a library card in Yavapai County, Arizona in April of that year. Della flew to Phoenix on a day near the end of September, rented a car, and drove 2 hours north, and the town was called Dewey, and it had 1 grocery store, one church, and single-story houses scattered across red earth with low juniper trees growing between them. The house at 41 Old Black Canyon Road had a porch, a rocking chair, and 3 pots of cactus. Mrs. Loretta Trask opened the door. She was about 70 with short gray hair, and she was holding a dish towel. "I'm looking for Mr. Wendell Trask," Della said. The old woman studied her for a moment, then she said, "He's gone, honey. 2 years now." Della stood on that porch and felt the past 4 months slip out of her hands like a plate. "Cancer," Loretta said. "Lung cancer. He worked at the harbor for 30 years. That's what happens to everyone who works at the harbor." She looked at Della's face and saw something there, and she opened the screen door. "Come inside. The sun is fierce out there." The house was cool and dark and smelled of coffee. Loretta placed a cup in front of Della and sat across from her, and for 4 minutes she didn't ask who Della was. Then she asked. "I'm Rafferty Malloy's wife," Della said. The dish towel in the old woman's hands went still. She didn't look surprised. That was what Della would never forget afterward. The old woman didn't look surprised at all. She simply set the towel on the table, folded it in half, and said, "I waited 4 years for someone to knock on that door. I always thought it would be the police." She stood and went into the back room. She was gone for 4 minutes. When she returned, she carried a brown paper envelope yellowed with age, and she placed it on the table between them without pushing it across. "Wendell wanted to talk," she said. "You have to understand that. 3 weeks after it happened, he sat at this very table with the police telephone number in his hand. He dialed 6 digits. She looked at the envelope. Then someone came. Della didn't touch it. "It wasn't the person you're thinking of," Mrs. Loretta Trask said. Della opened the envelope. Inside was just a paper. It wasn't a statement. It wasn't an affidavit. There was no notary seal, nothing official at all. It was a piece of graph paper torn from a notebook and folded into quarters, and the folds had begun to split. A man had written on it, by hand, in awkward ballpoint pen strokes. It gave a date. It gave an amount of money. It contained 2 words for silence, and at the bottom, on the right side, there was a signature. The signature was small, neat. It was the handwriting of a woman who had learned to write in a school that taught girls graceful penmanship during the 1940s, Beatrix Malloy. Della stared at it for a very long time. Outside, some kind of bird called. She came alone, Mrs. Loretta Trask said. No private car, no one with her. She took a taxi all the way from Sky Harbor Airport, and she sat in the exact chair you're sitting in now. The old woman looked toward the window. She didn't threaten him. She didn't bring anyone with her. She only sat there and spoke with Wendell for 2 hours. What did she say? She said that if this went to court, that name would break. And when a name like that breaks, it doesn't break alone. She said 400 people were putting food on their tables because of that name. Loretta turned the cup slowly between her hands. Then she said one final thing, and that was what made Wendell sign. Della waited. She said, "The boy survived. He's alive. But if I lose this name, I lose him too, because he'll have nothing left to stand on." The old woman set down her cup. Later, Wendell told me he believed she meant every word. He said, "Loretta, that old woman didn't buy me. That old woman begged me." Della picked up the paper. Her hand didn't tremble. That was the strangest thing. Her hand didn't tremble at all. "Why did he keep it?" she asked. "He wrote it himself, honey. She didn't make him write anything. She paid in cash with no papers, and after she left, there was nothing proving she had ever sat inside this house." Mrs. Loretta Trask looked at Della. "He sat at this very table that night and wrote it with his own hand, and he made her sign it before she walked back out to the taxi." The old woman shook her head gently. "I asked why he was doing it. He said, 'Loretta, one day that boy will come looking, and when he does, I don't want him to hear this from my mouth.'" Della sat inside the cool, dark house in Dewey, Arizona, holding a sheet of graph paper torn along its folds. She thought of an 84-year-old woman, taking her grandson's face between both hands, turning it left and right, and saying that his eyes were alive again. She thought of a dark, green cardigan worn thin at the elbow. She thought of 61 years and a ring and a sentence she hadn't understood at the time. The sentence telling her to keep wearing it, even after she learned the things about that family she was going to learn. Beatrix had known. She had known Della would find out. She had given Della the ring first, so that when the truth came, she would already be wearing it. Della folded the paper along its old creases and placed it in her coat pocket. On the flight back to Chicago that night, she sat beside the window and didn't sleep. and she looked down at the blanket of orange light stretching beneath her. And for 4 hours, she held the paper inside her pocket between 2 fingers. She knew exactly what her 2 choices were. She could give it to her husband and destroy the last thing still standing inside him. Or she could keep it from him. She could bury it because she loved that old woman. And because the old woman had possessed her reasons. And because 400 people were still putting food on their tables because of that name. Delavos sat aboard an airplane at an altitude of 10,000 meters and realized that the second choice was exactly the one Beatrix Malloy had made at the kitchen table inside the house at 41 Old Black Canyon Road 4 years earlier, alone, without bringing anyone with her. She had sat in that exact chair. The Malloy family returned to Kenwood that Saturday night, every one of them, 41 people in all. Because Rafferty Malloy had called, and in 4 years he had never called once. Some came out of curiosity. Some came out of fear. 41 people stood in the large dining room with glasses of wine in their hands, and asked no one sat because all the chairs had been removed. And Ella noticed that the moment she entered and understood that her husband had ordered them taken away 3 hours earlier. Beatrix Malloy sat at the head of the table in her dark green cardigan worn thin at the elbows. Dorothea stood behind her. Desmond Malloy stood to the left, 59 years old, dressed in a gray suit, holding his wineglass in both hands like a man who was cold. Della stood beside her husband at the far end of the room, and inside her coat pocket was a piece of graph paper folded into quarters. She had carried it for 3 days. For 3 nights she had lain beside him, and for 3 nights she had said nothing. Now she took it out. She didn't hand it to him. She placed it on the long table before 41 people, unfolded it and smoothed it flat with the palm of her hand, and she did it slowly while the entire room watched. "This belonged to a man named Wendell Trask," she said. "He inspected pressure valves at the harbor for 30 years. He died 2 years ago in Arizona. No one moved. He wrote it by hand at his own kitchen table 4 years ago. It gives a date. It gives an amount of money. It contains 2 words for silence." Della raised her eyes. "And there is a signature at the bottom." Rafferty Malloy looked at the paper. He read it from about 6 feet away, and Della saw the exact moment his eyes reached the final line, and his face didn't change, not even slightly, and that was the worst part. Desmond Malloy set his glass on the table. The sound of glass touching wood was very loud in that room. "Rafferty," he said. His voice was louder than it needed to be. "You let some strange woman bring garbage papers into this house. Stand up and speak, Uncle Boy." The room went silent. 41 people stood motionless, and no one breathed, and Dorothy lifted one hand to her mouth. Rafferty Malloy didn't move. Then he placed both hands on the rims of his wheels and pushed. 8 turns of the wheels. From the far end of the room to the head of the table was 8 turns, and he traveled all 8 slowly. And throughout those 8 turns, the sound of his wheels against the hardwood floor was the only sound inside the house built in 1921. He stopped in front of his uncle. He looked up. "You want me to stand," he said, "so you won't have to look down." Desmond Malloy said nothing. "For 4 years, you haven't looked directly at me once. You look over my shoulder. You look down into your wine. You read the scripture at my father's funeral while staring at the ceiling." He didn't raise his voice. "Today you'll look," and Desmond Malloy looked. He looked down, and something in his face collapsed, and all 41 people watched it collapse. Then came the sound of a chair scraping backward at the head of the table. Beatrix Malloy stood. She rose slowly, bracing both hands against the edge of the table, and Dorothea took half a step forward before Beatrix raised one finger. She stood upright, 84 years old, and she was the only person standing in that room who wasn't standing because there were no chairs. "I paid that man," she said. No one breathed. "I flew to Phoenix. I took a taxi for 2 hours. I sat at his kitchen table and spoke with him for 2 hours, and I signed that paper with my own hand. And I returned to Chicago that same day, and no one in this family knew where I had gone." She looked around the room, at every face in turn. "I knew what happened at Calumet Harbor. I knew who did it. Afterward, I sat beside Desmond at 2 weddings in this house, and I passed him serving dishes, and I knew someone at the far end of the room made a small sound. I did it because I thought I was saving this name," Beatrix Malloy said. 400 people put food on their tables because of this name. I sat alone in this house and calculated that the boy had survived, that he was still alive, while the name, if it broke, would break forever. She turned toward her grandson. She looked down at him in his wheelchair in the middle of the room, and her voice didn't break, though her eyes did. "I saved the name," she said. "I lost my grandson. For 4 years he lived 15 minutes away from me, and I didn't go to him because I couldn't bear to look at his face." She drew in a breath. "I made the wrong trade, Rafferty. I'm 84 years old, and I'm standing here before all of you saying it aloud. I made the wrong trade." No one applauded. No one spoke. 41 members of the Malloy family stood in the Kenwood dining room listening to an elderly woman confess that she had sold her own grandson, and not one of those 41 people moved. Rafferty Malloy sat in the middle of the room for a very long time. Then he pushed his chair toward the head of the table. He reached out one hand and took hers, the light, dry, remarkably steady hand that had placed a ring on his wife's finger 5 months earlier, and he held it. He didn't say anything. 3 weeks later, the file on Desmond Malloy lay on a desk at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and inside it was the piece of graph paper, along with the sworn statement of an 84-year-old woman signed in the presence of her own attorney. She asked for no immunity. She asked for nothing. St. Alban Church, a Ukrainian village, opened at 6 o'clock in the morning, and the choir rehearsed at that hour. And there were 11 people in the choir, and no one came to listen. On the first Saturday morning in November, 4 people sat in the pews. Rafferty Malloy sat in the front row. He had sold 2 transportation companies that summer and closed the back room at the restaurant on Taylor Street. And he hadn't done it to become a good man, and he had never told anyone that he had done it to become a good man. Della had asked him once in August why. He had sat quietly for a long time before saying, "I built that so no one could ever see through me again. I spent 18 years building it. Then a woman sat on a sidewalk and looked at me when I had nothing in my hands, and from that day forward I no longer knew what the empire was for." Sister Annette Calloway sat in the 3rd row with her cane propped against the pew. She said nothing. She only came every Saturday morning, beginning in June. In the 2nd row sat an 84-year-old woman wearing a dark green cardigan worn thin at the elbows, and it was the first time in 20 years that Beatrix Malloy had entered a church, and Dorothea sat beside her, holding her hand. In the choir, at the far right of the back row, stood an 8-year-old boy with curly hair beside his mother. Milo Kane had joined the choir in June, and no one there charged anyone $40. He sang 2 lines incorrectly. He still sang those same 2 lines incorrectly even now, and no one corrected him because Della had said to leave them that way. Della Voss sang the 2nd part. At 6:15 in the morning, the light filtering through the stained glass was still gray and pale, and there was no accompaniment, and she sang the song that a 47-year-old woman in Beckley, West Virginia, had used the final strength of her lungs to push into the world. When she finished, no one applauded. At St. Alban, people didn't applaud. She sat down on the step beneath the platform and reached behind her neck and removed the locket. The gray solder ran around its edge, a line of tin thick in one place and thin in another, made by a woman who had borrowed her neighbor's soldering iron one summer afternoon and ruined it 3 times before getting it right. Open it when you have nothing else left. Della sat inside St. Alban Church with her husband in the front row, an elderly woman in the 2nd, and a boy laughing in the choir, and she thought, "Mama, I have so much now. I have so much that it frightens me." Then she pried it open. There was no photograph inside. No lock of hair. Nothing at all except a tiny piece of paper folded into quarters, no larger than her thumbnail, and when she unfolded it, there were 4 words written in pencil, in the handwriting of a woman who had received little schooling. "Sing louder, my girl." Della Voss sat on the step beneath the platform at the St. Alban Church at 6:20 in the morning, and she bent forward and cried, and for the first time in 4 years, she cried aloud, and not one person in that room stood up and walked away. Some people pass through our lives and give us one thing after another, then take everything back because it belonged to them all along. And there are people who give us nothing at all. They simply look at us on the very day when we have nothing left to show anyone. That is the only gift in this world that no one can ever take back. Don't wait until you have proven something before believing you deserve to be seen. And if today you can be the person who stops on the sidewalk, then stop. If Della's story touched you, please leave a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel so that each day another meaningful story will be waiting for you. How did this story make you feel? Which character will remain in your heart the longest? please leave a comment. We truly want to hear what you feel from the deepest place in your heart. We wish you and your family abundant health, happiness, and peace every day. Goodbye, and we'll